group economics, it does sound kind of like, I don't know, something you'd hear in a university lecture hall, right?
Definitely has that ring to it.
But when you really get down to it, it's about stuff we see happening all the time.
Yeah,
Communities getting together, deciding to invest in themselves, building something from the ground up.
absolutely.
And speaking of which, you sent in this super interesting article from the Nation newspaper in Barbados.
Hmm.
Something about it must really struck a chord with you.
Yeah, it really got me thinking, especially given your interest in like the whole social dynamics thing. This article, it really dives deep into how communities they can actually use their collective power, to really make some economic gains.
Okay, so let's break this down a bit.
Hmm.
So they're defining group economics as basically communities setting up their own businesses, their own institutions,
Hmm.
right there in their own neighborhoods. And everyone benefits,
Hmm.
ideally.
Right.
And we see this kind of thing happening all the time, don't we?
Yeah, for sure.
Like, think about those shop local campaigns you see popping up.
Yeah.
Or those businesses, the ones
Right.
that just seem to thrive in certain communities.
Yeah.
You'd never find them anywhere else.
Exactly. But this article, it actually takes it a step further. It uses this really powerful example, kind of unexpected actually, a panhandler on the subway in New York City.
Wow, okay, now that's specific.
It is, right.
Right.
But hear me out on this. You've got this black passenger, and he gives the panhandler some money, right? Then other black passengers on that same subway car, they start giving him money too. And it kind of creates this mini economy, almost like instantaneously.
I see where you're going with this.
Yeah.
It's that whole idea of supporting your own, even in a small way, right? But is it really group economics if we're talking about, like, a couple of bucks changing hands?
That's the thing. The article argues it totally is. It's not just about the actual money itself. It's more about there's this underlying sense of shared identity, of responsibility even. The author even goes as far as to say loyalty begins by filling a stomach.
Wow.
Which is, I mean, that's a pretty powerful statement when you really let it sink in, right?
That is, actually. It's like you're not just giving a handout. You're kind of, like, investing in the well-being of your community.
Exactly. It's implying there's this deeper social contract happening where even contributing to someone's well-being in a small way, it actually like strengthens the whole community.
So we're not just talking about straight-up money here, right? We're talking about social capital, too. That whole idea that these connections people have within a community, that's a kind of currency in itself.
For sure.
But, and I think this is something we should address, the article seems to focus mainly on a specific demographic.
Hmm.
Doesn't that, I don't know, maybe limit the scope of what group economics really is?
That's a really important point you bring up, and it's something the article wrestles with, too. So yes, while it does focus on the experiences of a particular community, it argues that fundamentally these principles of group economics, they're actually universal.
Okay.
Like, think about it this way. Every single culture out there has some concept of us and them, right?
Sure.
Even something like those shop local campaigns we were just talking about,
Yeah.
that taps into that same idea, right?
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Appealing to a shared identity.
Exactly. So it's really about recognizing that these dynamics, they exist everywhere, even if they, play out in different ways depending on where you are.
So it's more nuanced than it might appear on the surface.
Definitely.
But here's where it gets even more interesting, I think. The article, it uses Barbados as this case study, right, to explore how group economics can be successful, but also where it can potentially go wrong. And it gets really specific about it, too.
Yeah, Barbados, it's a really interesting case. Historically, they've always relied on these local networks, especially in the period after emancipation. People, they kind of had to band together, support each other just to get by, right?
Yeah.
And that whole spirit of cooperation, it really ended up shaping their whole approach to economic development.
It's like that whole thing about resilience, When things get tough, communities, they can find strength in that shared identity, that ability to support one another. The article, mentions this whole thing about emigration and remittances, people leaving to find work, sending money back home.
Right.
It's a perfect example of that in action, doesn't it?
Totally. Emigration in this case, it wasn't just about individuals, trying to make a better life for themselves. It was strategic. Families, sometimes entire communities, they were investing in their own, in a way. Those who left, they sent money back, and that money, it fueled new businesses, created opportunities back in Barbados, this whole cycle of empowerment, and it was all rooted in those community ties.
That's pretty amazing, actually. It really highlights how these almost like informal systems of support,
Right.
they can have a huge EE impact.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
The article doesn't shy away from the complicated stuff either. Like, it points out that even in Barbados, with this really strong tradition of group economics, there were still inequalities.
Right, and that's where it gets really insightful, I think. It acknowledges that even in these communities that seem from the outside really tight-knit,
Hmm.
there are power imbalances. Some groups, they just had more access to resources, to land ownership, you name it,
Yeah.
than others.
Yeah, good reminder that history is never simple, right? Even in a system where the goal is to uplift a whole community,
Yeah.
you're still going to have these underlying factors that can lead to, well, disparities. But it does seem like things have, I don't know, shifted in Barbados. And not necessarily in a good way. The article talks about this kind of breakdown, a move away from that model of group economics. What happened?
Well, they point to a few things. One is the centralization of jobs. As more and more people moved away from those traditional ways of making a living into the more urban areas,
Hmm.
those tight-knit community structures, they started to, I don't know, fray a bit. Another factor is the rising cost of living. Just getting by has gotten tougher, right? Let alone having anything extra to invest back into your community.
It's almost like what made those communities strong in the first place, the shared experiences, the way everyone depended on each other, it started to unravel as the economy changed.
Yeah.
And the article brings up this really interesting point about land ownership, too.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
It argues that as land became more centralized, property values went up. And it became harder, much harder for everyday people to, get a foothold.
Right.
And that had this ripple effect, right? Harder to invest in your community, harder to start a business, even harder to afford to live in the place where you grew up.
So you've got this, like, perfect storm, in a way. Economic shifts, social structures changing, barriers to things like land ownership, and all of it working against the very things that made communities like those in Barbados so resilient in the first place.
Yeah.
And that's where this deep dive takes, I don't know, maybe a slightly darker turn.
Yep.
Because the article, it goes on to connect this breakdown of group economics with a rise in crime. It's like, I don't know, almost like when those support systems, the ones that have always been there, when they start to fall apart, when
Yeah.
people start to feel like they're losing their footing,
Yeah.
it creates this void. And sometimes, well, crime, it fills that void.
Yeah, and it's a tough thing to think about, Because the article seems to be saying that crime, it's not always just about individual choices. It's way more complicated than that. It's
Right.
tied up with economic opportunity or the lack of it, obviously, but also like social cohesion, that sense of belonging. Remember that phrase, loyalty begins by filling a stomach.
Right.
It takes on a whole new meaning when you put it in this context, doesn't it?
It really does. It
Yeah.
makes you think about the bigger picture here, about how something like economic instability or even just like the feeling of insecurity, that
Mhm.
they can have these ripple effects, right? Impacting everything from how safe a community feels to, just how people feel about themselves, their lives. But I keep coming back to something we were talking about earlier, this idea that group economics, as powerful as it can be, it's not inherently good or bad in and of itself. It's more like a tool, I guess. And like any tool, it can be used in a lot of different ways.
That's a great way to put it. It's about how it's being used and who it's ultimately benefiting, right? And I think that's why this article, it's so important. It's not trying to give you easy answers or say group economics is this perfect thing. It's more like it's challenging us to really think about what's going on beneath the surface, what could go wrong, and how important equity really is.
Almost like a call to action, in a way. Like,
Yeah.
okay, we're starting to grasp these dynamics, but now what?
Yeah.
What can we actually do with this knowledge? How
Mhm.
can we use it to build communities that are stronger, but also, more fair?
I think that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? What would it look like to harness this power of group economics, but make sure it benefits everyone, not just a select few?
Right. Not just going back to the same old patterns.
Mm.
And that, I think, is where you, the listener, come in. Because this isn't just some abstract concept we're talking about here. This is playing out in communities all over the world, right? In our own backyards.
Absolutely.
So as we kind of wrap up our deep dive here into group economics, I think we're left with this final question, something for everyone to chew on. If you could design a program right there in your own community, something that really promotes economic empowerment, but equitable economic empowerment, what would it look like? What would you prioritize? How would you make sure that everyone, no matter their background, no matter their circumstances, how would you make sure everyone has a real shot at being a part of it, a real shot at thriving? These are questions worth thinking about. Because who knows, maybe, just maybe, the answers could help us build a future that's a little bit more just, a little bit more prosperous for everyone.